The Supreme Court chamber sank into an almost reverent silence as Representative Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, her posture sharp with confidence. She gripped a thick folder of documents, her expression calm but intent. For months, quiet murmurs had circled within legal and academic circles. Questions surrounding Justice Amy Coney Barrett's true depth of constitutional expertise. Yet until this moment, no one had dared to challenge her so directly. "Justice Barrett," Crockett began, her tone firm and crystalline, each word echoing through the ornate chamber. "I hold in my hand documentation that directly contradicts statements you made under oath regarding your legal education." With deliberate precision, she opened the folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper. Barrett's ordinarily composed expression faltered for a fraction of a second. Just long enough for the shift to register among those watching. Committee members leaned forward instinctively. Court reporters froze, pens suspended mid-sentence. In the gallery, law professors and legal correspondents exchanged uneasy glances. "This transcript," Crockett continued steadily, "shows that your public testimony regarding your constitutional law qualifications was, at the very least, misleading to the American public." Justice Barrett reached for her microphone, her practiced calm beginning to strain. But before she could speak, Crockett pressed forward, and what followed would leave even seasoned judicial observers stunned. The revelation she was about to unveil would send tremors across America's legal establishment. Before we step deeper into this extraordinary confrontation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from, because what unfolded next would redefine the meaning of judicial accountability. Representative Jasmine Crockett had not built her reputation overnight. Years of diligent work had carved her into one of Congress's most formidable interrogators. A proud graduate of the University of Houston Law Center, she had once walked the tense corridors of Texas courthouses as a civil rights attorney, defending constitutional principles with unflinching resolve. Now, at 42, she brought that same courtroom precision to Capitol Hill. Her colleagues, both allies and skeptics, knew one thing for certain. When Crockett began questioning, it was never improvisation. Across from her sat Justice Amy Coney Barrett, one of the youngest and most ideologically influential members of the Supreme Court. Appointed by President Trump in 2020, Barrett had quickly risen from respected academic to the pinnacle of American jurisprudence. Her Notre Dame credentials, deep Catholic faith, and strict originalist philosophy had made her a conservative icon. But beneath that polished narrative, rumors had persisted that her self-proclaimed expertise in constitutional law might not align with the academic record she presented to the Senate during her confirmation. That quiet skepticism had turned into public controversy when Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard published a detailed critique questioning the accuracy of Barrett's academic claims. "The public deserves complete transparency," Tribe had written, "especially when the integrity of lifetime judicial appointments hangs in the balance." Barrett had dismissed the allegations as politically motivated attacks. "My record speaks for itself," she had declared. But for Crockett, that statement wasn't enough. Over several painstaking weeks, she and her staff had combed through law school archives, bar association records, and testimony from academic colleagues. What emerged was troubling. Barrett's supposed concentration in constitutional law seemed far thinner than her sworn testimony suggested. Now, in the marble grandeur of the Supreme Court's public chamber, history was being written. It was an exceedingly rare occurrence for a sitting justice to appear before Congress under oath. The room was filled with reporters, constitutional scholars, and citizens watching history in real time. Cameras whirred softly as Chairman Johnson called the session to order. "This hearing," he announced gravely, "concerns judicial transparency and qualifications for lifetime appointments to the nation's highest court." "Representative Crockett," he added, "you have the floor." Crockett inclined her head respectfully, then turned toward Barrett, meeting her gaze with cool focus. "Justice Barrett," she began, "I'd like to start by clarifying certain facts about your legal education. During your 2020 confirmation hearings, you testified that you specialized in constitutional law at Notre Dame, correct?" Barrett leaned toward her microphone. "Yes, that is correct. Constitutional interpretation was central to my studies and teaching." Crockett's tone remained neutral. "And you also testified that you had published extensively on constitutional originalism prior to your nomination." "I did," Barrett said confidently. "My academic record in that field is substantial." Crockett lifted the first document from her folder. "Let's enter Exhibit A into the record, Notre Dame's official publication index during your tenure." She handed copies to the committee staff. "Justice Barrett, This document shows you authored 2 peer-reviewed articles on constitutional interpretation before your nomination, not the extensive body of scholarship you described under oath. Would you like to clarify that discrepancy? A heavy silence followed. Barrett's jaw tightened slightly. Representative, the quality of scholarship matters more than the number of publications. Both articles were highly regarded within academic circles. Let's move on then, Crockett replied smoothly. Exhibit B, your Notre Dame academic transcript. It indicates that you completed only 1 advanced course in constitutional law, not the concentration you claimed. The majority of your coursework appears to focus on religious liberty and statutory interpretation. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Barrett's attorney leaned forward, whispering urgently, but Barrett raised a hand, refusing counsel. My teaching and judicial experience compensate for any perceived gaps in coursework, Barrett replied evenly. I've taught constitutional law for many years. Crockett was ready. That brings us to Exhibit C, Notre Dame's course catalog during your time as faculty. She handed out the next set of papers. According to these records, you taught constitutional law for 1 semester only. Your recurring courses were civil procedure and religious freedom. Neither directly addresses constitutional interpretation as a field of study. Even Chairman Johnson shifted uneasily. Crockett, however, remained precise and professional. Justice Barrett, she continued, this isn't about questioning your intelligence or faith. It's about the accuracy of your sworn statements. The American people deserve full honesty from those entrusted with lifetime authority. For the first time, Barrett's composure wavered. Representative, you're misrepresenting my record by selectively using information. My qualifications were thoroughly reviewed during confirmation. Were they? Crockett countered, retrieving Exhibit D. This is the Senate Judiciary Committee's formal request for your full academic records. You'll note here, she pointed to a highlighted section, that only a summary prepared by your staff was submitted. Your original transcripts were never produced. Gasps rippled through the audience. A senior journalist from the Washington Post was already typing feverishly. Barrett's attorney interjected sharply. Mr. Chairman, this questioning seems intended more to humiliate than to inform. Crockett's tone never rose. Mr. Chairman, she said calmly, the Supreme Court's legitimacy depends on the people's trust. When the evidence suggests that sworn statements don't align with the record, that trust is jeopardized. This isn't partisanship, it's about integrity. She turned back toward Barrett, raising Exhibit E, a set of course syllabi. Here we have syllabi from constitutional law classes taught during your tenure. Other professors' syllabi include more than 100 foundational cases. Yours covers 37, nearly all focused on religious freedom. How does that align with your claim of comprehensive constitutional expertise? Barrett's composure finally cracked. My teaching approach emphasized depth, not breadth, she said tersely. And yet, Crockett replied, flipping through her notes, during your confirmation, you testified that you taught the full breadth of constitutional law. That statement appears directly contradicted by your own materials. The tension was now thick enough to taste. One legal analyst whispered, this is unprecedented. For nearly 2 more hours, Crockett pressed forward, unveiling exhibit after exhibit, each one revealing inconsistencies between Barrett's words and her documented record. Finally, she raised one last document sealed in a transparent sleeve. Justice Barrett, this is your 2002 faculty application to Notre Dame. In the section asking for your areas of expertise, you listed, quote, civil procedure, evidence, and religious liberty law. Constitutional law was not listed at all. How do you reconcile that with your claim of specialized expertise? Barrett hesitated. Her polished confidence faltered. That was over 20 years ago. My expertise has evolved since then. Crockett leaned forward slightly. Evolved enough, she said quietly, to interpret the Constitution for generations of Americans? The room fell completely silent, without formal study or significant publication in the field. Crockett asked, her voice measured but firm. Justice Barrett, the issue isn't whether you're intelligent or capable of learning. The issue is whether you accurately represented your qualifications to the Senate and the American people. As the confrontation continued, legal experts in the gallery began passing notes to journalists. The mood in the room shifted from curiosity to concern as the gap between Barrett's stated qualifications and the documentary evidence grew increasingly apparent. The turning point came 3 hours into the hearing. Representative Crockett removed a final document from her folder, one she had saved until this moment. Justice Barrett, I have here something I believe you'll recognize. She held up a sealed envelope. This is a letter from Professor Richard Garnett, your colleague at Notre Dame Law School. Professor Garnett has authorized me to open this letter in today's hearing. The room fell completely silent as Crockett carefully opened the envelope and removed a single page. Professor Garnett writes, as a senior faculty member at Notre Dame Law School and colleague of Amy Coney Barrett for 15 years, I feel compelled by conscience to clarify the record. While Justice Barrett is an intelligent jurist with expertise in certain areas of law, her background in constitutional interpretation was limited prior to her judicial appointments. When asked during her Supreme Court nomination to evaluate her constitutional expertise, I and several colleagues expressed reservations privately to the Senate Judiciary Committee, noting that her academic focus had always been narrower than represented. These concerns were never addressed. I write this not from political motivation, but from commitment to truth and the integrity of our institutions. Crockett looked up from the letter. Justice Barrett, this letter is signed and notarized by Professor Garnett, who has been your supporter and colleague for years. He's a conservative legal scholar with impeccable credentials. How do you respond to his assessment? The color drained from Barrett's face. Her lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, but she seemed momentarily unable to respond. The gallery erupted in hushed conversations. A senior judicial correspondent was seen rushing from the room, presumably to break the story. After what seemed an eternity, Barrett composed herself. Representative Crockett, Professor Garnett is entitled to his opinion. But this isn't presented as opinion, Crockett interrupted gently. Professor Garnett cites specific concerns raised to the Senate Judiciary Committee that were never disclosed publicly. I have here the committee's confidential record showing these concerns were indeed received but not shared with the full Senate prior to your confirmation vote. She produced another document. This is a letter signed by 17 constitutional law professors from across the political spectrum, stating that your published work prior to nomination showed concerning gaps in fundamental areas of constitutional jurisprudence. This assessment was also provided to the committee but never made public. Barrett's lawyer stood. Mr. Chairman, request a brief recess. Before recess, Crockett said, I want to be absolutely clear about something. This isn't about political differences or judicial philosophy. Many brilliant conservative jurists have impeccable constitutional credentials. Justice Gorsuch, for example. This is about accurate representation of qualifications to the American people. She turned to address Barrett directly. Justice Barrett, the question isn't whether you're qualified now after 3 years on the court. The question is whether you misrepresented your qualifications during the confirmation process, denying the Senate and the public the opportunity to make an informed decision about your readiness for the court. At that time, the chairman reluctantly granted a 15-minute recess. As Barrett and her team exited to a private room, the hearing chamber buzzed with activity. Legal commentators who had witnessed the exchange were already appearing on news networks describing what they'd seen in stunned tones. In my 40 years covering the court, I've never seen anything like this. One veteran Supreme Court reporter told his audience, Representative Crockett came with receipts, actual documentary evidence that directly contradicts Justice Barrett's sworn testimony. This isn't partisan theater. It's a serious credibility issue for a sitting justice. When the session resumed, Barrett returned with a visibly different demeanor. Her lawyer remained seated as she addressed the committee directly. Mr. Chairman, Representative Crockett, I've consulted with my team and reflected on the evidence presented today. While I maintain that I was qualified for my position, I acknowledge that certain statements during my confirmation process may have overstated the formal extent of my constitutional law background prior to my judicial service. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Barrett continued, her voice quieter but resolute. I believed my understanding of constitutional principles was sufficient, but I recognize that precise accuracy in describing one's qualifications is essential to maintaining public trust. For any overstatement, I apologize to this committee and to the American people. The chairman looked stunned. Legal experts in the gallery sat motionless, processing the unprecedented admission from a sitting Supreme Court. Justice Representative Crockett, maintaining her professional composure, simply nodded, once in acknowledgement. Thank you for that clarification, Justice Barrett. The record will reflect your statement. As the hearing concluded, the impact was immediate and profound. Legal experts who had defended Barrett previously now appeared on camera looking shaken. What we witnessed today was extraordinary, said a conservative former federal judge in national television. Representative Crockett didn't engage in political attacks. She presented indisputable documentary evidence that raises serious questions about the confirmation process itself. The vindication for Crockett was complete when 3 Republican committee members approached her after the hearing to privately commend her professionalism and thoroughness. This wasn't a partisan hit job, one was overheard, saying this was oversight at its most essential. By evening, the confrontation between Representative Jasmine Crockett and Justice Coney Barrett dominated every news network and online platform. Number Crockett receipts and number Supreme qualifications trended nationwide as millions watched clips of the methodical dismantling of Barrett's credentials. Within 24 hours, the ripple effects began to spread through Washington's power centers. The Senate Judiciary Committee announced a special review of its confirmation procedures with bipartisan support. Today's revelations raised troubling questions about whether our vetting process is sufficiently rigorous for lifetime appointments, the committee chairman stated in a press release. Legal scholars across the ideological spectrum weighed in with analysis. Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe appeared on Evening News, visibly moved. What Representative Crockett accomplished today transcends politics, he explained. She defended the integrity of our institutions by insisting on factual accuracy and transparency. The Supreme Court's legitimacy depends not on ideology, but on the honest representation of qualifications and background. Conservative legal commentator Jonathan Turley, often a defender of Barrett, wrote in his widely read blog, "While I continue to respect Justice Barrett's intellect and integrity, the documentary evidence presented today cannot be dismissed as partisan attack." Representative Crockett's approach was measured, evidence-based, and focused on institutional integrity rather than ideological disagreement. For Barrett, the aftermath required careful navigation. 3 days after the hearing, she issued a formal statement, acknowledging that in the intensity of the confirmation process, certain aspects of my background were emphasized, while others were minimized. I regret any impression of misrepresentation and recommit myself to the transparency and honesty the American people deserve from their judiciary. The White House maintained careful distance with the press secretary, stating only that the administration respects the constitutional separation of powers and the independence of the judiciary. Behind closed doors, however, sources reported intense discussions about the implications for future nominations. For Crockett, the aftermath brought national recognition beyond anything she had experienced previously. Law schools across the country requested her to speak on ethics and institutional integrity. The American Bar Association invited her to lead a special committee on judicial qualification standards. Perhaps most significantly, the confrontation sparked a broader national conversation about qualifications versus political alignment in judicial nominations. Editorial boards from the Wall Street Journal to the Washington Post called for reforms to the confirmation process. Representative Crockett's methodical approach revealed a fundamental flaw in how we evaluate nominees, wrote a respected conservative judge in the Federalist Society Review. We have become so focused on ideological alignment that we have sometimes overlooked the basic question of expertise and experience. This does a disservice to our legal system regardless of political perspective. 6 months after the confrontation, its legacy continued to evolve. The Senate unanimously passed new disclosure requirements for judicial nominees requiring comprehensive academic and professional records rather than summaries. These requirements notably had bipartisan sponsorship. Barrett herself, after initial speculation about possible resignation, chose instead to demonstrate her commitment to growth. She enrolled in advanced constitutional law seminars at Georgetown and invited distinguished scholars from across the ideological spectrum to provide private tutorials on areas where her background had been limited. Legal historians began to recognize the Crockett-Barrett confrontation as a watershed moment in judicial accountability. What made this confrontation historic wasn't that it brought down a justice, explained a constitutional historian at Yale. It's that it ultimately strengthened the court by reinforcing that qualifications and honest representation matter more than political alignment. For ordinary Americans, the confrontation offered a rare moment of clarity in an often confusing political landscape. A retired teacher in Ohio expressed what many felt. "I watched the whole thing, and what struck me wasn't the gotcha moment. It was seeing someone care more about the truth in our institutions than about scoring political points. We need more of that." 3 years later, when another Supreme Court vacancy arose, the impact of the Crockett-Barrett confrontation was unmistakable. Nominees from both parties arrived at confirmation hearings with unprecedented transparency in their records. The focus on substantive qualifications rather than ideological litmus tests marked a subtle but significant shift in how America selected its highest jurists. As for Representative Jasmine Crockett, she continued her work with the same methodical commitment to facts and institutional integrity that had defined that historic day. When asked years later about the confrontation's impact, she responded with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Justice Barrett and I disagree on many legal questions, and that's as it should be in a diverse democracy," she said. But what we established that day transcends those disagreements. The principle that our institutions depend on honest representation and transparency. That's not a partisan value. It's an American one. The confrontation between Crockett and Barrett ultimately became more than political theater or a partisan victory. It became a case study taught in law schools about the essential role of oversight in maintaining institutional integrity, and a reminder that in America's constitutional system, truth and qualifications must transcend political alignment. If you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of today's most important political confrontations. Leave a comment below telling us what other oversight hearings you'd like us to analyze.